When people hear the word monitoring, they often imagine constant watching, like someone staring at a screen and waiting for something bad to happen. In privacy program work, monitoring is much calmer and more deliberate than that, because it is really about learning whether your decisions are working the way you intended. If your organization has privacy goals, privacy controls, and contractors who touch personal data, you need a way to check whether real life matches what was promised on paper. Monitoring is the bridge between good intentions and trustworthy outcomes, and it is also the bridge between a privacy program and the business leaders who want proof that the program is doing something valuable. In this lesson, you will learn how to choose monitoring methods that match your goals, match the controls you rely on, and give you a clear view into contractor performance without turning privacy into a never-ending surveillance project. By the end, monitoring should feel like a practical feedback loop that helps you prevent problems, spot drift early, and explain results in plain language. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to start is to separate three ideas that beginners often blend together: goals, controls, and monitoring. A goal is what you are trying to achieve, like reducing unnecessary data collection, improving how quickly requests are handled, or lowering the chance of a privacy incident. A control is the mechanism you use to make the goal more likely to happen, such as approval steps, access limits, retention rules, training, or vendor contract clauses. Monitoring is the way you check whether the control is operating as expected and whether it is producing the result you care about. If you monitor without a goal, you end up collecting noise and producing reports that do not change decisions. If you have goals without controls, you have wishes, not a program. If you have controls without monitoring, you have blind faith, and blind faith is not a risk strategy. The key skill is choosing monitoring methods that create useful evidence, not just lots of data. To choose monitoring methods well, you need to understand the difference between outcome measures and control measures. Outcome measures tell you whether you are getting the result you want, such as fewer complaints, fewer policy exceptions, better response times, or less overcollection. Control measures tell you whether the mechanism is working as designed, such as whether reviews are happening on schedule, whether access requests are approved properly, or whether retention rules are being applied. Outcome measures can be influenced by many factors at once, including changes in the business, changes in customer behavior, or changes in law, so outcomes alone can be misleading. Control measures can be more direct because they focus on whether the organization is doing the specific thing it said it would do. A strong monitoring plan usually combines both, because you want to know that the engine is running and that the car is actually moving in the right direction. When a contractor is involved, this combination becomes even more important because you may not have full visibility into their internal operations. A privacy control can fail in more than one way, and monitoring methods should be chosen with those failure modes in mind. Sometimes a control fails because it was never implemented, meaning people thought it existed, but it was not real in practice. Sometimes it fails because it is implemented but not followed, like a policy that exists but no one reads, or a review step that gets skipped when things are busy. Sometimes it fails because the control is followed, but it is designed badly, like a consent process that confuses users or a retention rule that is so vague nobody can apply it. Contractors add another layer, because the control might exist in your contract, but their day-to-day behavior could drift over time, especially when they change staff, change tools, or expand services. Monitoring is not just about catching bad behavior, and it is also about catching ordinary drift that happens when systems and people evolve. A monitoring method is good when it can detect the kind of failure you are most worried about before the damage is done. One of the most practical tools for selecting monitoring methods is to think in terms of evidence types and how strong each type is. Some evidence is direct and observable, like a record that a deletion request was fulfilled or a log showing who accessed a dataset. Some evidence is indirect, like a manager's statement that a process is followed or a contractor's annual letter saying they have a security program. Both can be useful, but they serve different purposes, and they should not be treated as equal. Direct evidence tends to be stronger because it is closer to what actually happened, while indirect evidence is often easier to get but easier to misunderstand. In privacy program monitoring, you rarely get perfect evidence, so the goal is to choose evidence that is strong enough for the risk and realistic for the relationship. If the contractor handles very sensitive data, you should expect stronger evidence and more frequent checks. If the contractor has limited access and low impact, lighter monitoring may be appropriate, as long as it still supports your goals and obligations. Another way to choose monitoring methods is to decide whether you need preventive monitoring, detective monitoring, or corrective monitoring, and most programs use all three. Preventive monitoring checks whether the conditions are in place to prevent issues, like verifying that training is completed before access is granted or confirming that a contractor has named a privacy contact and a clear escalation path. Detective monitoring looks for signs that something has gone wrong or is starting to go wrong, like unusual access patterns, repeated late responses, or inconsistent handling of requests. Corrective monitoring checks whether fixes were actually completed, like confirming that a remediation plan was done and that the same issue does not return. Contractors often focus on detective monitoring because it feels concrete, but preventive and corrective monitoring are what keep you from living in a constant cycle of surprise and cleanup. When a privacy program is mature, monitoring feels less like hunting for mistakes and more like steady maintenance that keeps the machine healthy. Aligning the type of monitoring to the type of risk keeps the work focused and avoids overreacting. Before you decide on a monitoring method, you should be clear about what you are monitoring: the contractor as a company, the service they provide, or the specific data processing activity they perform. Monitoring the company is broad, like checking whether they maintain a privacy program, whether they have incident response capability, or whether they have independent assurance reports. Monitoring the service is narrower, like checking whether their customer support system meets the privacy requirements you agreed on, or whether their hosting environment is consistent with your data location expectations. Monitoring a processing activity is the most specific, like checking whether they delete data when instructed, whether they only use data for the allowed purpose, or whether subprocessors are approved before they are used. Beginners often default to broad company-level monitoring because it is easy to request, but the strongest alignment to goals usually happens at the service and activity level. If your goal is to ensure timely deletion, a company-level statement about privacy culture is not enough. You need monitoring that touches the actual deletion behavior and the evidence that it happened. Good monitoring also respects an important boundary. Monitoring is not the same as controlling. You can set requirements and collect evidence, but you cannot realistically run another organization's daily operations. This is why monitoring methods should be designed around what is feasible to request and what is reasonable for the contractor to provide, while still being meaningful. For example, you might require regular performance reports, samples of completed request handling records, or proof that access reviews occurred, rather than demanding real-time access to all internal systems. Monitoring methods should avoid creating incentives for contractors to hide problems, because the best relationships are the ones where issues are surfaced early and fixed quickly. If monitoring feels like punishment, you may get perfect-looking reports that do not match reality. If monitoring feels like shared accountability, you are more likely to get honest signals when something drifts. The goal is to design a monitoring approach that supports trust, while still verifying that the trust is justified. Now let's connect monitoring methods directly to privacy program goals, because this is where the alignment becomes concrete. If your goal is data minimization, monitoring methods might focus on whether the contractor collects only the agreed fields and whether optional data collection is kept off by default. If your goal is purpose limitation, monitoring might focus on whether the contractor uses data only for the services you asked them to provide and does not reuse it for unrelated analytics or product development. If your goal is timely rights request handling, monitoring might focus on turnaround times, the quality of identity verification steps, and whether records are retained properly. If your goal is secure processing, monitoring might focus on access controls, separation of environments, and evidence of patching or vulnerability management that relates to systems handling your data. The pattern is that each goal suggests a different kind of evidence and a different frequency of checking. When you align monitoring to goals, you can explain why you are asking for something. and that makes the monitoring more fair and more effective. Controls are the second anchor for choosing monitoring methods, and a simple way to think about controls is to ask what the control is supposed to prevent, detect, or correct. If the control is an approval step, the monitoring method might be sampling approvals to see whether they are completed and whether the right people are approving the right things. If the control is a retention rule, the monitoring might be checking whether data older than the retention limit is actually removed from active systems and backups according to the agreement. If the control is training, the monitoring might check completion rates and whether the training is relevant to the people who touch the data, rather than being a generic yearly activity. If the control is a contractual clause, the monitoring method might check whether the contractor's behavior matches the clause, such as whether subprocessors are disclosed and approved. This is important because some controls look strong on paper but are weak in practice, and monitoring helps you learn which controls are truly doing work. Over time, you can adjust your controls based on what monitoring reveals, which is a sign of a healthy program. When contractors are involved, performance monitoring has to include both privacy obligations and service performance, because the two are connected in real life. A contractor who regularly misses service deadlines may also miss privacy deadlines, not because they are malicious, but because their processes are overloaded or poorly managed. This is why privacy monitoring often includes service-level indicators like responsiveness, escalation handling, and staffing stability, even though those sound more like operational metrics. For example, if a contractor's support team turns over frequently, identity verification mistakes may increase, and requests may be mishandled. If their change management is chaotic, you may see technical drift, where new features are introduced without proper privacy review. A privacy program should not pretend that privacy is separate from operations, because privacy outcomes depend on reliable operational behavior. Monitoring methods that capture both sides give you a more accurate picture and help you predict problems before they become incidents. A critical monitoring choice is deciding between continuous monitoring and periodic monitoring, and the right answer depends on risk and practicality. Continuous monitoring usually means frequent, automated, or near real-time signals, like alerts for unusual access activity or regular dashboards showing request volumes and response times. Periodic monitoring means scheduled checks, like quarterly reviews, annual assessments, or sample-based audits. Continuous monitoring can detect drift faster, but it can also generate noise and create alert fatigue if it is not carefully tuned. Periodic monitoring can be easier to manage and easier to align with contract cycles, but it may miss fast-moving issues. Many organizations blend the two by using continuous monitoring for high-risk, high-change areas and periodic monitoring for stable, lower-risk areas. For contractors, continuous monitoring may be limited by what you can access, so you might rely on regular reports rather than direct telemetry. The key is that monitoring frequency should match how quickly a problem could cause harm and how quickly you could realistically respond. Sampling is one of the most powerful monitoring methods for privacy controls because it is realistic and still meaningful when done thoughtfully. Instead of trying to inspect every single transaction or request, you select a small set of cases and examine them deeply. For rights requests, sampling might involve reviewing whether verification was performed consistently, whether the response addressed the correct person, and whether deadlines were met. For deletion obligations, sampling might involve checking whether a set of records were removed across the relevant systems and whether the evidence supports the claim. Sampling works best when it is risk-based, meaning you sample more from areas with higher risk, more frequent changes, or known past issues. Sampling also helps you detect patterns, like recurring mistakes that suggest a training gap or a process flaw. Contractors often understand sampling because it is common in many assurance activities, and it can feel less intrusive than broad demands. A well-designed sampling approach can provide strong confidence without overwhelming everyone involved. A common misconception is that monitoring is only about finding failures, but strong programs also monitor for improvement and maturity. If monitoring only produces bad news, people learn to fear it, and the organization may resist it. When monitoring also identifies what is working, it becomes a source of learning and stability. For example, you might monitor how quickly a contractor escalates privacy questions and find that one team responds consistently well, which you can then reinforce as a best practice. You might monitor how often exceptions are requested and discover that the control is confusing, which leads you to simplify it, reducing both risk and friction. Monitoring can also help you make smart investment choices by showing which controls are providing real value and which controls are expensive but weak. In that sense, monitoring is not just oversight, and it is program steering. When you treat monitoring as steering, you naturally align methods to goals, because steering only works when you are measuring the right direction. As you choose monitoring methods, you also need to keep an eye on proportionality and privacy itself, because monitoring can accidentally become invasive if you're not careful. Monitoring should focus on whether obligations are being met, not on collecting unnecessary personal data about individuals. For example, you usually do not need to monitor the content of personal messages to verify a retention policy, and you might only need metadata like timestamps and deletion status. You should also consider data minimization in your monitoring records, meaning you keep only what you need to prove performance and manage risk. Another proportionality idea is to avoid monitoring that creates a lot of effort but offers little insight, like requesting long narrative reports that are never read. Strong monitoring is targeted, easy to interpret, and tied to decisions that someone will actually make. If a monitoring output does not change behavior, improve a control, or support accountability, it is probably not the right method. The best monitoring feels like a simple instrument panel that helps you drive safely, not a pile of paperwork that sits on a shelf. As you bring everything together, you can think of a monitoring method as a match between three pieces: what you care about, what you rely on, and what you can observe. What you care about is the goal, like lawful processing, respectful handling of rights, or reduced incident risk. What you rely on is the control, like contractual limits, approvals, training, or technical access boundaries. What you can observe is the evidence you can realistically obtain from your own environment and from the contractor. When these three pieces align, you get monitoring that is defensible and useful because you can explain why it exists and what it proves. When they do not align, you get monitoring that is either weak, unfair, or wasteful, and none of those help a privacy program succeed. In practice, you will often refine monitoring over time as you learn which signals are meaningful and which are noise. That refinement is not failure, and it is the normal way a program becomes smarter. The main idea is to always bring monitoring back to goals, controls, and contractor performance outcomes that matter. Monitoring can feel abstract until you picture the story it tells over time, and that story is what leaders and auditors often want to hear. The story might be that a contractor was on board with clear privacy requirements. Controls were put in place. Monitoring showed stable compliance. A drift signal appeared when the contractor changed a system, and the issue was corrected before it became harm. That story depends on monitoring methods that detect drift early, not months later, and on evidence that can be summarized clearly. It also depends on monitoring being built into the normal rhythm of the relationship, rather than being a surprise interrogation when something goes wrong. For a beginner, it helps to remember that monitoring is not a single activity, and it is a set of small, repeated checks that create confidence. It is also a way to reduce the stress of uncertainty, because when you have monitoring, you do not have to guess whether things are fine. You can show it, measure it, and improve it. By now, monitoring should feel less like a mystery and more like a practical design choice that privacy program leaders make on purpose. The smartest monitoring methods are the ones that fit your goals, verify the controls you depend on, and provide a realistic view of contractor performance without demanding impossible access or endless paperwork. They combine outcome signals with control signals, use a sensible mix of continuous and periodic checks, and rely on evidence that is strong enough for the risk. They also respect proportionality, which means they gather only what is needed and focus on decisions that actually improve the program. When you learn to choose monitoring methods this way, you stop treating monitoring as a generic requirement and start treating it as a tool for confidence and learning. That is what makes a privacy program durable, because it can adapt as services change, contractors evolve, and the organization grows. Most importantly, it helps you protect people's data in ways you can explain, defend, and steadily improve over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.